Is artificial difficulty real? If you were to ask 10 people what artificial difficulty was, you might just get 10 different responses. So at first glance this might seem like proof that people are just making excuses for their lack of gamer skill and that artificial difficulty isn't real, but that would be a short-sighted take. However, if we were to dive beneath the surface of these 10 different answers, we would likely find some connecting threads, and it's in these threads we find the fundamental truth of what these complaints are really about. So in this video I hope to show that when people make genuine complaints about artificial difficulty in games, they're really not complaining about the difficulty. No, they're complaining about the way in which the difficulty has been achieved. As hinted at in the intro of the 10 different responses comment, artificial difficulty comes in many different forms. Some are more obvious than others, some have a bigger impact on the player's experience, and the way it rears its head varies widely depending on the genre. And to complicate things even more, yes, some people might indeed just be venting and making excuses for their own skill issue. All of this muddies the water and makes artificial difficulty a vague, abstract concept that's hard to discuss objectively in a way that just doesn't devolve into get good mudslinging. So in this video I'm going to show a few examples that are very different from each other and hopefully clearly explain why some gamers would categorise them as artificial difficulty. There's a reason why racing game footage has been rolling in the background for a bit now, although the game being shown isn't actually a bad offender of what I'm about to talk about, at least on the expert difficulty setting. The footage is from Wreckfest, a great experience that any racing game fan should give a go if they haven't already, especially if you like multiplayer. The reason Wreckfest footage has been rolling is because the racing genre in general is home to one of the most painfully obvious forms of artificial difficulty, a concept generally known as rubber banding. Let's jump back to many moons ago when I was but a young sage, in the days of the PS1 and early PS2. While not the first home gaming platforms to have racing games, the genre had a massive boom in popularity during the PS1 era, and young me was completely along for the ride. Gran Turismo, Ridge Racer, TOCA, Destruction Derby, Colin McRae, V-Rally, Need for Speed and many more. It was just a genuinely fantastic time for the genre and its fans. So at some point while playing these PS1 and early PS2 titles, young me noticed something on his own. At the time I didn't care much for the internet and didn't come to know the rubber banding term until maybe 2 decades later, but I was already familiar with it in all but name. Young me noticed that in some games, no matter how well I was doing in the race with AI opponents falling behind, they'd suddenly, magically, catch right up to me again in a way that simply defied all logic. It was as if they'd just been fired forward without ever having to use the brake. What I'd noticed was rubber banding, even if I didn't know its name at the time. Now if this is your first time hearing the term, imagine a giant rubber band around the player and their AI opponents. This band restricts how much the game is willing to let the player get ahead of the pack, a stretch limit so to speak. And after a certain point the AI opponents will get magically shot forward again so they're just behind the player, as if the band has contracted again. This can even work in reverse depending on the game, so if the player has fallen behind the AI opponents, they will actually slow down a bit until the player catches up. So when young me noticed this for the first time, it was eye-opening. For the first time I stopped playing games as a gamer, and I started to experience it from a developer's perspective. I could see beneath the hood, I could see what the developers were doing in terms of this rubber banding mechanic, and I could see why they were doing it. And let's just say, I absolutely hated it, as did many other racing game fans that noticed it in those early days of racing games. So let's break down why rubber banding falls deeply into the artificial difficulty category. 1. It makes the player's skill feel less meaningful. It doesn't matter how much you master the track and how fast you drive, rubber banding means opponents will always be on your tail because the game will only let them fall so far behind before magically teleporting them forward to you. 2. It's very blatant cheating for the AI. It's obvious that they're not playing by the same rules as the player. 3. It feels cheap. as it's so obvious when the rubber banding kicks in. From a player's perspective, it feels really artificial. You know the developers have only done this as a band-aid instead of developing competent AI opponents that feel natural, so it's a bit like hitting a nail with a sledgehammer. 4. All of this combined is immersion breaking. It really takes you out of the experience. Once you notice rubber banding, it no longer feels like a genuine fair race, because it isn't. Even as a young sage, I felt this strongly. It's actually what triggered my interest in immersion in games, which has stuck with me ever since. Another broad genre of games that suffers from obvious AI cheating is the strategy genre. Be it real-time strategy, turn-based, or grand strategy, many of the games under the strategy umbrella contain artificial difficulty as a way of forcing a more challenging experience for the player. It's common for the developers to simply give the AI factions free money or resources, free or cheaper military units, or other advantages not given to the player. The problem is that being games with depth, they naturally attract players who thoroughly enjoy understanding all of the mechanics and how everything works, so these are exactly the kind of gamers who are going to notice all of the various sneaky AI cheats the developers have implemented. So just as rubber banding makes players' skill feel less meaningful in racing games, these AI cheats in strategy games can make the player's tactics and careful planning feel less meaningful as well. For example, what's the point of cutting off an enemy faction's port to block their trade route if they're just going to be given free money at the start of their next turn? Or what's the point of pushing hard if you know it's going to trigger the AI faction to get a free stack of troops to spawn out of thin air, which might overwhelm you? So in games that are all about strategy, these AI cheats end up making the player's strategic choices less meaningful, and for many players, that's a big negative for their experience. The next couple of examples are much more specific and less of a problem overall, but they still neatly fit into the artificial difficulty box. The first of these is from a favourite franchise of mine, the long-running Dynasty Warriors. On the surface level, these games have you cut down hundreds or even thousands of enemies like they're blades of grass, so the challenge certainly isn't in the combat. Instead, these games try and force a level of challenge by using a method that feels quite cheap from the player's perspective. They make the player's ally army, in a word, useless. No matter which side of the battle you're on, your allies' constant cries for help make these battles 50% fighting and 50% babysitting simulators.
My power alone is insufficient for a comeback. Appears the resistance is futile.
I can't hold on much longer. We need a way through.
This has been brutal. I don't know how much more I can take. I cannot afford to fall here. I must find a way to overcome this situation. I can't lose like this.
So instead of the actual fighting being difficult, the challenge is in the player having to zigzag across the battlefield as quickly as they can from A to B to save an ally before they die, and then from B to C to save the next crying ally before they die, and so on.
Just the right time. Quickly, lend us a hand. Now. You weren't able to leave me in danger, were you? Ha ha! You truly are one of a kind.
I'm glad it's you who has come to my aid. I would choose no other.
It was a truly embarrassing spectacle. Still, thank you for your help. Thank you for rushing in to save me. Help me be free from this predicament. You came! You're the best ally that one can ask for.
I regret that I must implore you for aid like this. But your presence sets my mind at ease.
The enemy officer. Stepping stone on my path to true might.
This is a clear design choice by the developers, but from the player's perspective it feels quite forced or even outright immersion breaking. For a game that's trying to depict two large armies clashing, to always flip the force strength on the stage so that the player's army is weak no matter which side they pick, that can take you out of it and it stops it from feeling like a real battle between two forces. It's no wonder that this has been one of the biggest complaints from fans of the series going all the way back to the early 2000s. And again, it's not like this is actually making the game too challenging, it's not. It just doesn't feel like a good way of challenge being implemented due to how forced and obvious it is. A basic counter-argument given by some fans to this is, well, if they made your allies competent, then the game would be too easy. It's obvious why some people would say this, but it's short-sighted as it assumes no other changes would be made to compensate. For example, the actual fighting could be made more challenging and deadly to achieve difficulty that way. The existence of the Mount and Blade franchise shows that you can indeed have challenging battles without artificially making things more difficult for the player's side the way that Dynasty Warriors does. This final example is potentially the most controversial one to talk about, so obviously it had to be saved for last. When Elden Ring released, the greatly increased use of input reading really kicked up a fuss, with many disliking it and the Get Good side defending it. For clarity, Elden Ring doesn't actually have input reading, it has animation reading, but from the player's perspective, the difference between the enemy reacting to an input and reacting to the first frame of an animation is so minuscule it might as well not exist. It's basically input reading in all but name. As a huge fan of the Souls games, I know that, and as I just alluded to, Elden Ring certainly wasn't the first From Software game to use animation reading, it just greatly increased how much it's used. So why did its use receive so many more complaints in Elden Ring? Well, simply because of how blatant it is. While previously it was something you'd notice now and then, in Elden Ring with some enemies it's so obvious it can make fights feel borderline robotic in terms of how they play out, instead of feeling like organic fights between two opponents. You know that if you perform an action like healing within a certain range, it will trigger an instant attack from the enemy 100% of the time, specifically designed to interrupt you. Or certain spells will 100% trigger a dodge roll, amusingly when they're not even being fired at the enemy. The fact that this happens shows how crudely the animation reading has been implemented. From Software simply didn't put in any effort towards making its implementation feel natural. Of course, it's easy enough to learn your way around these animation reads, for example by only healing while being a considerable distance from the enemy, or when they're still locked into an attack animation. However, the fact that you're tied into playing this way in order to avoid the animation reading attacks, this is what causes the fights to feel robotic instead of natural encounters between two foes. So while animation reading is entirely normal, it's the way in which it's been implemented in Elden Ring that tips it into the artificial difficulty category. For example, a more organic implementation could have a trigger rate of 30 to 50% instead of 100%, and variable trigger speeds, so instead of being triggered on frame 1 of an animation every time, it could trigger randomly between a small range of frames instead. These two simple things combined would go a long way towards making the enemy reactions feel more natural from the player's perspective, instead of repetitive, frame-perfect robots. As I mentioned as my goal at the start, In the 4 examples given, I hope you've noticed that the reasons behind them being examples of artificial difficulty had nothing to do with them actually being too challenging for the players, and everything to do with the way the challenge was being achieved. Despite being very different types of games with different forms of artificial difficulty, there's connecting threads of the artificial difficulty being immersion breaking, or feeling cheap due to how obvious the AI advantages are, or they reduce how meaningful the player's skills or successes are. Ultimately, these genuine complaints about these features are a critique of the developers' design choices, a critique about the way they've achieved the difficulty and not the difficulty itself. So as we come to a close, if you're someone who always wondered what people really mean when they say artificial difficulty, or if you're someone who simply thought these people were making up excuses, then I hope that this video has provided clarity or opened up a new way of seeing things for you.